So as we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people of the land where we are, and all of us are in different places. We remember those First Nations people on whose land we live and walk and work. We honour them and their ancestors for their survival, for their continued traditions, their spiritual connection, and their caring of country, of sky, water and sea. We pay respect to the elders, past and present, and we will continue to support their right for self-determination. Certainly here in southeast Queensland, we're committed to reconciliation, and we respectfully recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded in this country. You may like to use the chat box to name the country that you sit on at the moment, the First Nations people whose land you occupy at the moment. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bishop Jeremy Greaves. I'm the Bishop of the northern region of the Diocese of Brisbane in southeast Queensland. And I understand there's people here from Queensland, from around Australia, and probably further afield. So welcome to you all. It's a real pleasure and joy to introduce Miranda Threlfall-Holmes, who's with us this evening here, this morning in England. Miranda's team rector of the St Luke in the City parish in Liverpool in the north of England. She's previously been principal of Eustenoff College and chaplain and Solwell Fellow of University College in Durham. She's been a parish priest in Durham and in Newcastle Diocese. She's a historian and worked in a huge range of jobs from, we were talking before, from being in a sandwich production line to working in brand management for Procter & Gamble. She's a member of the Church of England's General Synod. She's written about half a dozen books, including The Essential History of Christianity, and also, fascinatingly, in collaboration with her then 13-year-old son, the Teenage Prayer Experiment Notebook. Miranda's a poet and a hymn writer, and it's a real joy to have her with us to talk about her latest book, How to Eat Bread, 21 Nourishing Ways to Read the Bible. So welcome, Miranda.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be with you all.
Yeah, terrific. Miranda, when I look at my bookshelves, at a glance, I can see, dozens of books about the Bible. There's commentaries, there's histories, there's different translations. Why did you think we needed another one?
It's one of those things that's been pondering away at the back of my mind for several years, that because every so often someone would come up to me in a parish and say, I don't really understand how to read the Bible. Where do I start? Can you give me something to read about it? And yeah, I've got shelves and shelves of books like that, but I couldn't find anything that was the right thing to give people who were asking that in my parishes. There was quite a lot of stuff that was kind of aimed at the student market, and that tended to be quite dense and perhaps a slightly higher reading level and assume a certain amount more background than people would necessarily feel comfortable with. And often material on how to read the Bible comes from quite a conservative background, which is fine for some people, but some of the people who were asking me were asking from a perspective of having come out of that culture and saying, if I'm not going to take it all literally, then why should I bother reading it at all? Which was a question that hadn't really occurred to me until people started asking it. And I couldn't find a single thing that I could give to them. So I'd been thinking about with various clergy friends that actually we really needed something like this for some time, and I hadn't had the confidence to write it because I'm not a biblical scholar by training. And then over lockdown, we found ourselves doing online services, online daily prayer, as I'm sure many people have done. And I found myself effectively doing a little online Bible study every single day with my parish. We were going through whole books of the Bible. And I was saying things which to me seemed obvious, you know, and people were going, really? Wow, I'd never heard that. And I thought, right, okay, I need to write this now.
So 21 different ways, you know, and so for some people who
had to pick a number.
But for people who might think, you know, there's one plain reading of the text, that could be quite a challenging idea.
Yeah, it's part of the reason why I wanted a number on the cover, really, to make it very clear from the beginning that this is about a kind of multiplicity of different approaches. And of course, they don't conflict. But one of the reasons for writing it was that I mean, we've all noticed, I'm sure, an increasing polarization in the church between, you know, two increasingly different camps on so many different topics, and obviously the lines are drawn in slightly different places on different subjects. But how we read the Bible seems to have become increasingly tribal. And one of the things that I'm hoping that that this overcomes is something of that. So I'm hoping that people who think there is only one way to read the Bible, you know, you just open it and read it and do what it says, who will often demonize people who kind of go, oh, I have a liberationist approach or a black approach or whatever, and that gets dismissed as woke. I'm hoping that if that's the way you prefer to read the Bible, as one plain meaning, that reading this will help appreciate that some of the other approaches are valid and serious, even if they're not ones that you would prefer to use yourself. And similarly, that people who, you know, from the kind of extreme liberal end, who might go, well, if we're not taking the Bible literally, why bother reading it? Which is something I've heard. We'll kind of go, okay, actually, reading this, I see that there are many different ways of taking it seriously that don't mean, you know, throwing out your intellect and your other approaches. And I've structured it in 3 different sections because I think there are 3 very different areas of this. So the first section is kind of particularly aimed, I suppose, at people who have a much more traditional viewpoint. And I think there'll be people who will read and enjoy and use the first section and maybe find the second section interesting, but will completely ignore the third section, and that's fine. So the first section is about ways that the Bible itself reads the Bible. Because obviously the Bible was written over a huge period of time. So for quite a lot of when people were writing bits of the Bible, there are other bits of the Bible already in existence. And you can see, particularly through the Old Testament, people using and reinterpreting and applying parts of the Bible in the past. And, you know, I've picked 7, but I could have written many more. And so even if people have you know, what we might call quite a conservative, quite a literal approach and find anything else quite suspicious, then I hope that first section will be really helpful in saying, look, these are kind of biblically modeled ways of reading the text.
Because we kind of assume that, you know, pre-Enlightenment, you know, everyone had a sort of literal understanding of the text, and that, you know, one of the, certainly in parts of the more liberal tradition, you know, there's almost an arrogance that says, you know, we bring this great scholarship which kind of deconstructs that primitive understanding, but that's not the case.
No, it's not. And I mean, I was a medieval historian as you know, when I was at university doing my PhD, and this kind of modern cynicism and snobbery about the past really annoys me. You know, so the second section is about kind of historical ways from the early church through the medieval period that people read the Bible. And it seems very clear to me that the idea that the Bible is either true or it's not, the idea that it's either, you know, literally true and you have to believe every single word of it, or it's not true and, you know, we clever modern people know far better than those people in the past. Those are both products of the Enlightenment. They're both products of that kind of 17th century empirical turn, whereas before that, people read the Bible in a whole variety of different ways. And the idea that you would take it literally as science seemed complete anathema to people. I've got what, can I read a quote?
Yeah.
This is one of my favorite quotes to prove this point, because it's amazing how many people don't believe me when I say that. They're kind of, no, don't be ridiculous. Everybody in the past thought the earth was flat, thought that God had dictated the Bible, thought every word was true, until, you know, these modern people in 1800 started ruining it all. This is a quote from Oregon, I can never pronounce Latin, De Principiis, so from the early church, and he says this about Genesis: who that has any understanding, and that's one of the quite polite translations, you know, you could translate it as, you know, who but a complete idiot, who that has any understanding will suppose that the first and second and third day, with evening and morning, existed without a sun, a moon and stars. And who is so foolish as to believe that God, like a farmer, planted a paradise and placed in it a tree visible and palpable, so that tasting of the fruit by the bodily teeth you obtained life? And if God is said to walk in the paradise in the evening and Adam to hide himself under a tree, I don't suppose that anyone doubts that these things figuratively indicate certain mysteries, the history having taken place in appearance and not literally. Now, you know, you can debate what Oregon says. Just because he's writing in the early church doesn't mean he's necessarily right. But the point is, he says, you know, surely nobody would doubt. I don't suppose anybody would doubt that. The idea that you would take that literally is completely bemusing to him. He finds that totally baffling. And so that's a really important corrective to thinking that this is simply a modern concern.
So how do we make that decision then around, you know, I think most people could say, yep, absolutely agree with Oregon on that. Happy to concede the science. But, you know, Jesus said some stuff, and yeah, that's the stuff that we'll take absolutely literally. So, like, how do we make those decisions?
No, stop. That's sounding perilously close to what I, you know, it's one of those things that I hear quite a lot, which drives me around them, which is kind of, I like the God of the New Testament. I like the God of love of the New Testament, but I'm not sure about this angry God of the Old Testament.
I think it's about, yeah, how do we weigh up?
It's a really basic heresy.
But it's really, you know, you talk about the layers of meaning, and, you know, the literal and the allegorical and the tropological and anagological. How do we, you know, hold those either in tension or choose particular ones, or, you know, what do we do with all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, there are lots and lots of different ways of reading the Bible, and you've you know, summarized some of them. The reason I've given the book this kind of mad title, How to Eat Bread, you know, just product placement there, is because it seems to me that fundamentally the Bible is meant to be nourishing. It's meant to feed us. And so we read it to be nourished in our faith and in our life. And so there's an element of discernment in, is this reading, is this way I'm thinking of, is that nourishing? One of my favorite approaches to spirituality and to reading the Bible is the Ignatian approach, which uses your imagination and so on. Now, not everybody kind of gets on with that particular way of reading the Bible, but the fundamental Ignatian principle in the examen practice and so on is that you pay attention to what he calls the movement of the Spirit. So is something consoling or disconsoling in his language? Is it, you know, the good spirit or the bad spirit? And that sense of, now that's not simply, you know, does this make me feel happy or do I find this challenging? And I think that approach can very easily be dismissed as just kind of picking whatever you feel happy with. But it's about honestly attending to what's going on in you, what fruit are growing and so on. I mean, Augustine has this wonderful principle where he addresses exactly that question, because, you know, again, this isn't a new question. People in the 3rd and 4th century were, you know, really exercised about this. One of the chapters in here is about Augustine's principle of love. So Augustine says, you'll read the Bible in lots of different ways. Took it for granted that you would read it both literally and allegorically, and kind of see what sense you made of it that way. And that if your reading tends towards you loving God more and loving other people, creation more, then it is a correct reading or a valid reading. And if it doesn't, then it's not. And I mean, it's fascinating when you actually read what he actually says rather than just that little summary. He's incredibly radical, because I think quite often the idea that, you know, if your reading of the Bible tends to love, then it's a good one, could be dismissed as a very wishy-washy, liberal, modern idea. You know, Augustine actually says, even if your reading is completely wrong, even if you've read it and you could get a wrong reading based on your misunderstanding of a translation or your misunderstanding of the historical context or something, the early church writers were very aware of those dangers. But you know what he says, in a way, it doesn't necessarily matter. If you had a completely wrong reading, you completely misinterpreted what was there, but your reading ended up making you love God more and love other people more, then it would be okay, because that's the goal. The goal is not to understand the Bible. The goal is to know and love God. The Bible, he says, is a tool to get there. I mean, it's an incredibly low view of the Bible in some ways. I mean, it's an incredibly high view, but it is not the end point. The end point is to know and love God.
Which is a very different approach from where we tend to land, which is, you know, people faithfully reading the scriptures and coming to a sense of what they might mean. And then, you know, often that becomes then a weapon to sort of bludgeon those who would faithfully read the scriptures and come to a different point. You know, so how do we, you know, how do we do that work of holding together in that middle space when we're all faithfully, you know, doing our best to understand the scriptures?
Yeah, and partly what I'm hoping with this book, I mean, I'm hoping that it will help people to, you know, to know and love and appreciate the Bible in new and fresh ways, and perhaps particularly the bits of the Bible that people find really difficult and really challenging. But I'm also hoping that it might help us to bridge that divide. It's the first book I've written that I kind of feel if everybody read this, you know, it could really make a difference. Because I mean, just writing it gave me a much deeper appreciation of some of the different perspectives and views in there. And as I say, not everybody is going to, I'm not thinking that everyone's going to read this and then go, oh, right, which method of reading the Bible shall I use today? Oh, it's day 3, so I'm going to use method 3 today. You know, that's not the idea. The idea is partly to give you a bit of a toolkit so that for particular parts or particular challenges, you've got tools that you can approach, but partly to help you understand what other people are doing when they use a particular approach or come to a particular conclusion, so that you might go, oh, I still don't agree with that, I still don't like it, but I can at least see what you're doing and what the seriousness is with which you've done that. So, for example, the final section, I'll say the first section is about ways that the Bible itself reads the Bible. 7 of those. I kind of just, because I like round numbers, I picked 7 of each. The second section is 7 historical ways that the Bible reads, that people read the Bible. So 7 ways from our tradition. And the final section, I had this kind of recipe book theme going on. So the first section is called From the Store Cupboard, you know, what you can just pull out and make a meal with because it's there. Second section is called Grandmother's Recipe Book, things from the past that might be a bit weird, but might be useful. And the third section I've called Molecular Gastronomy, because I quite like the sort of mad Heston Blumenthal school of cookery. I don't do it, but I love reading those cookbooks. And so that's the section that's got in it things like, you know, liberation theology, a hermeneutic of suspicion, an ecological approach. And these are ways that I think people are often very suspicious of, or conversely quite attracted to, but without necessarily understanding what they really are. And things like form and genre criticism, they're things that people can quite easily feel intimidated by. you know, that if you've got a library of books behind you, as you know, so many of us have on our Zoom calls, it can really easily intimidate other people into thinking that you've got to have read all those books before you can have an opinion about the Bible. And of course, you know, that's what I think people who say, look, the plain meaning of the text is all you need, are trying to get at, really. It's that kind of fundamental Reformation concern that this is not the preserve of experts solely. There is a simple literal meaning. There might be more to it, but there is a simple literal meaning as well. And, you know, everything, you know, it's our Anglican heritage, isn't it? Everything you need for salvation is there. You don't need 17 PhDs in Greek and Hebrew scholarship to be nourished by the Bible. But actually, also don't be intimidated by people who have. They will know things that are interesting and helpful and that you might want to also bring in to your banquet, that might season it. And so, you know, when people are talking about genre criticism or hermeneutic of suspicion, don't be intimidated. Here's a kind of simple primer as to what they're talking about. Now, some of those things you can do for yourself. You know, anyone can read the text looking for women or looking for liberation. But we can't all sit there carbon dating ancient papyri and comparing this with the Gilgamesh epic and so on. But it's useful to know what's going on behind those kind of things and to understand them. So I'm hoping that final section is not so much it's more like reading a Heston Blumenthal cookbook. It's not so much go and do this yourself in your kitchen. It's enjoy reading this and kind of have a sense of knowing what's out there.
What do we do with those parts of the Bible that don't nourish us, the bits that horrify us or appall us, you know, because the temptation is to either explain them away or minimize them or say, you know, yes, that was then, this is, you know, so what do we do with those really quite horrific parts of the scripture, you know, the texts of terror, or, you know, however we might name them?
Yeah, the kind of, the Bible tells us to go and commit genocide. What do we do with that? Absolutely. And that's one of the things that, in a way, I really struggled with when I was going through my ordination training. I was like, what do we do with these? I think one of the seeds of this book for me was when I was reading the story of David and Bathsheba, and the way the prophet Nathan tells that story about the two farmers with the sheep. It gets Nathan really angry and then turns around and goes, aha. And I had a bit of a light bulb moment. This was several years ago, and it's one of the chapters in the first section of this book, but it was, in a way, it was the seed of this whole book for me. Because I suddenly thought, hang on a minute, the way that Nathan uses story there in order to get David angry, he evokes something of God's passion for justice in David. And then David responds out of his anger and out of that connection he's got with an innate sense of justice, with something of God's passion for justice. And then when he has that violent, that outrageous reaction, Nathan turns around and goes, right, now what's that saying to you then? And I suddenly thought, this is not simply an interesting historical or mythological story that's about a particular person trapping a particular person. That's a model for us of one of the ways that scripture is using story and telling us, that modeling for us, that we can use story like that too. And that's when I started going through going, well, actually, what other ways then does the Bible show us that we can use scripture and use story in that sense? And so it seems to me that in that story, Nathan is saying, and you know, Genesis is saying, when something fills you with anger or rage or passion or whatever strong emotion it is, and this is where I find the examine practice very helpful, go, right, okay, what if the point of that story being there for me today is to evoke that emotion in me? What if the whole point, so if I read, you know, go and throw those children of your enemies, dash their brains out against a rock, and I go, whoa, I can't say this is the word of the Lord after that. What if the point of that being in there is exactly to make us horrified and to go, oh my God, you can't do that. No, you can't. And so the Bible is saying, look, does that make you happy? No, it doesn't. Of course, you're not going to do that. That is outrageous. Well, then actually reflect on your own history, reflect on the ways in which your culture and society has done that. And that we hide away from it. You know, you began today by talking about the land and the history, and actually it's really important that we honor that and are aware of the ways in which our history has done that. And it's a really easy distancing mechanism, I think, for ourselves to read the bits of the Bible that horrify us and go, oh, yeah, we have this kind of cultured disdain that goes, oh, these horribly barbaric people in olden times who behaved like that. You know, obviously we wouldn't do anything like that. But actually, when they make us really angry, I think the challenge is to say, okay, and now open your eyes and look at your own world and say, well, what in your life is doing that? Now, probably we're not bashing babies' brains out against rocks, but actually, what are we saying? We are dehumanizing, prepared to sacrifice so that our own standard of living can be maintained. And actually, it's not so far from that to, actually, I'd quite like to have cheap fashion, so I'm not that interested really in what happens to children in sweatshops. And taking, you know, so when something makes you really, really angry or really disgusted, notice that emotion and use it as a tool for self-reflection.
So what about with children? You know, how do we introduce them to the sort of nourishment that the scriptures bring? You know, I grew up hearing some of those terrific Old Testament stories, and you know, as soon as you bring a bit of scholarship to them, some of those are quite horrific. So is it okay to, you know, share those stories and for children to enjoy them just as stories? Or, you know, how do we do that work of, you know, at some point you obviously fell in love with the scriptures. Was that because of, you know, as a child hearing the stories, or was there something else? You know?
I mean, children love the gory bits. You don't need to shy away from the gory bits. So one of my strongest memories was going into a primary school once, and somebody asked, they were invited to ask me any questions they wanted about the Bible. And one of them said, what's the story in the Bible that's least told? And I thought, gosh, that's a good question, isn't it? I said, I probably don't know the answer, because probably it's a bit that I haven't even noticed because it's not told. But I was thinking, what am I going to say? And I told them the story of Jael and the tent peg. Oh my goodness, they loved it. Their teacher looked horrified. The children absolutely loved it. They relish all that kind of stuff. Do you know, I think one of my key passions is whether children or adults, but actually children are much more open to this than adults, is just encouraging people to encounter God for themselves. And you mentioned at the beginning the Teenage Prayer Experiment notebook. There it is, everyone. I love this book. Please all buy it and read it. And that was in a way my first kind of foray into this kind of experimentation. I had this 12, 13-year-old son. I wanted to get him involved in prayer and religion, and church wasn't doing much for him. And I couldn't find a book to buy for church children for their confirmation. Everything was kind of what you should know about Christianity. And I thought, they all know this. They're from Christian families. And so we tried just saying, okay, this is a way of prayer, try it and see what happens. And it was phenomenal. And that really has started me off on a journey of actually just encounter God and see what happens and trust your own reactions. And I think that's behind a lot of this as well. So in terms of reading Bible stories with children, absolutely read them. I think it's quite important not to do the kind of lies to children thing. So, you know, I wouldn't tell them personally the story of Noah's Ark and then hope that 20 years later I could say, oh, by the way, that isn't actually historically true, and not have them completely freaked out. You know, I would start from the beginning saying, you know, here are some stories lost in the midst of time that are about, you know, why Israel beginning to make sense of its identity. Let's read this story and see what it sparks in you. What does it tell us about God? Not this is something that particularly happened at a particular point in history that we can date. But in a way, even if you think that it probably did happen at a particular point in history, it doesn't matter. That it doesn't seem to me that the point is to give us a history. The point is to help us to think about God. So with children, what I love to do is read a story and get them to respond to it artistically. So one of the things that I've learned from our Sunday school here, run by a wonderful retired Methodist minister, and she will read them a story, sometimes a Bible story, sometimes some of those wonderful children's picture books that just evoke questions and so on. And she'll have them all around the table, and they've all got a piece of paper and a pen, and they're just drawing and doodling. But quite a lot of autistic children, so this really helps. And they're drawing and doodling as she reads the story. So they haven't got to concentrate, they haven't got to look at her. And then when she finishes, they're asked to share their picture. And over lockdown, we've been doing this on WhatsApp. So they all upload their picture to WhatsApp, and then we can all look at them. And tell us why they drew what they did. And the things that they've drawn out of it tend to be absolutely fascinating. If I'm in an actual church setting, I love doing this. Sometimes adults look at you really strangely if you do this with adults, but they do get into it eventually. If you've got a load of Lego, TM, other cheaper building blocks are available, but people often have got a whole load of Lego up in the attic. So if you can get a whole load of Lego out of people's attics and put people around tables and have just a random tin of Lego on each table, read a Bible story, read it 2 or 3 times in a kind of Lectio Divina way, and ask them either together as a table or individually as they prefer, because some people prefer to work together. Yeah, absolutely, comments about godly play is kind of taking the godly play idea, and get them to model the story. And it's just brilliant, because then you ask them to share what they've made and the detail that people pick out. People will sit there saying, well, I've put an angry face on this Lego figure because I think, at this point, the reaction of this character is going to be this. This is what they're thinking. And they've chosen to model a particular time. I'm doing this with the crucifixion once with a group of Boy Scouts. And one of them had modelled, he'd stuck long bits that were red and blue on the side because the detail that had stuck out for him from the story was the blood and water gushing from Jesus' side. Now, that is not a detail from that story that I've ever known someone pick up on or be discussed. But because he'd modelled it, because it was you have to have quite a visual imagination. So you've got to pick something visual. And that's what he'd modelled. So we had, an incredible discussion about that. So, yeah, if you take one thing away from this, get some Lego out and see what happens.
We've got a few questions coming in the chat. And Jonathan Holland, I wonder if you'd like to unmute and offer your question first of all.
Yeah, thanks, Miranda. I've got your book on order, but it hasn't arrived yet, so forgive me if I'm being ignorant here. I'm just wondering about Jesus' use of his scriptures of his day, and whether the way he used the scriptures provides a bit of a model for the church of our time. And I suppose I've got in mind, say, the use of his scriptures at the Nazareth in the synagogue, where he actually adds a bit to the quote from Isaiah and leaves a bit out, I think. And then you've got the Sermon on the Mount where he says, you've heard it said, but I tell you. So he kind of overrides the scriptures, and whether the church would therefore feel a lot freer in kind of moving the scriptures around according to its particular context.
Yeah, it's absolutely. I do find myself wondering whether actually I need to do a follow-up book that expands on that first section on how the Bible uses the Bible, because I was doing it in the 3 sections. I wanted to have these 3 parts. I've only got 7, so I've got a mix from across the scriptures on ways that the Bible uses the Bible. So I haven't got. There were so many examples I could have chosen, and so many different ways. I do think there might be a whole book in that, really. There's so much there. I've got a section on on the idea of Jesus as fulfilling the scriptures. So that theme through the Gospels, the idea of fulfillment, and what do we do with that? And you know, just being wary of the anti-Semitic ways that that's sometimes being used, but also the different ways in which it can help us to think of how the Old and New Testaments go together. I've got 2 chapters on, I thought I'd focus on one example rather than going too busy. I've got 2 paired chapters on the temptations of Jesus and that dialogue between Jesus and the character of the tempter. As a kind of mini masterclass right at the beginning of Jesus's ministry in how you handle scripture, and how, you know, parts of the, obviously there's the question of, you know, do you proof text or not, and how that's not hugely helpful because you can always put them together. But also the way in which Jesus uses scripture as a kind of foundation to build on. That sense of, this is the kind of bedrock. These stories of Exodus and you know, manna and so on are a kind of theological bedrock that I can stand firmly on and then not be shaken. You know, it goes, look forward to the parable of building on rock and sand and so on. Like, it seems to me that there's a huge amount there in that dialogue right at the beginning of Jesus's ministry, going, okay, how are we going to use scripture? How is Jesus going to use it? But yeah, those examples you give would, there may well be another book in this in a few years' time.
Thanks. Sue Grimmett, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Miranda. Thank you. It was a very timely book. I also apologise if I'm missing something because I haven't completely read it all, but I did get a lot. It was timely for the lectionary to have just that story from Nathan come up for preaching, because, you know, I really like that idea of the stories being a shadow, being a mirror for us to look at our own shadow selves and what we might not like to see, but is still there. But I was grateful that the lectionary text didn't continue the story that Sunday, because, you know, we can, what I've written down here, I'll use my notes because then I won't go on too long. We've set ourselves free from literal readings, but it can be a harrowing experience still when people bring their own shame to the table when they hear a reading and are expecting themselves just the kind of judgment that they hear dished out in some sections of scripture. And how do you deal with that when that intersection of people's pain and stories about God being the one doing the punishing, God killing babies, for instance, as punishment for their father's sins, such as in 2 Samuel there, after Nathan has spoken his piece in the story and the death of David and Bathsheba's son.
So how do we deal with the, yeah, and this of course is where we have this tradition of preaching, as well as the people reading the scriptures for themselves, because there's definitely a pastoral wisdom that anyone preaching is going to have to exercise in what's the appropriate and helpful message to draw out from this text for this congregation today, isn't there? So I mean, it's been said many times in feminist studies that, you know, the emphasis on the sin of pride is very much a male emphasis historically, you know, and actually for women, the sin of shame is much more problematic. And certainly one of our congregations has a lot of people who have kind of been rejected, have experienced rejection from church, and we're kind of functioning as a bit of a safety net. And so in some congregations I might focus on actually how are you going to do better, but in other congregations I would focus on actually, you know, do you know what, you're doing okay here. I also want to point out we have this tendency, which again I think is the product of you know, thousands of years of kind of patriarchal readings of the text. We have this tendency to equate the powerful man in any story with God. So, you know, so we'll assume that the king who's dashing the babies against the rock or who's meting out punishment is God. And, you know, part of my historical research several years ago was looking at just how the church has always, through history, said, this is the kind of society and politics we want to model. Oh, isn't it convenient that God as Trinity models exactly that? Nowadays we say, oh, network relationships, God as Trinity is lovely. But, in the Middle Ages, they said feudalism. Isn't it wonderful that God is so hierarchical? And in the 17th century, when absolutist theories of kingship were being developed, they said, absolutism. Isn't it wonderful that God is primarily one? It is so, sorry, this is a bit of an aside, but I love it. It's so obvious that, and so laughable when you look back in history, that you do think, oh gosh, what are we not missing? What are we missing today in what we say? There was a point when parliamentary government in England was being set up in the kind of late 18th, 18th century. There's a prayer in the Book of Common Prayers from then that talks about Jesus as God's prime minister. It's just bonkers. Anyway, so we have this history of tending to assume that the powerful man in the story is God. And I think one of the things that story and feminist readings, and all liberation readings really, challenge is why? Whose interest is it in to say, oh, the powerful man in this must stand for God? And actually, what if we see the story as challenging the behavior of the powerful man and saying, actually, this is how powerful individuals behave, but this story might be critiquing that. It's quite interesting to read some of the parables like that.
Sam Wells did a terrific piece with the widow and the judge, and his reading of that. Yeah, what if the widow is God, and completely flips the understanding.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. I mean, there's a wonderful priest in Liverpool diocese who's written. You can find it online. I'm like, oh gosh, I've forgotten all the names now. It's on the Gospel of Matthew. I'll have to send it to you, Jeremy, when I find the link. But he goes through the whole Gospel, all the parables, doing this, saying, what if? The parable of the labourers in the vineyard. Actually, why are we? I quite love that. I love that story. I love the idea of this sort of topsy-turvy, upside-down sense of generosity. But he says, actually, what if we're saying, actually, this is a critique of the capitalist system where people are just hanging around waiting to be paid? And who is this person to come along and say, oh, I've got the power to patronise you? Yeah, it's fascinating.
There's a sense then in which playing with the scriptures, being playful with them, is quite okay. Like we have, there's a temptation to hold them, to be so reverent and hold them with such as completely precious, that we're resistant to doing this work of play that we're quite happy to do with children. How do we recapture that sense as grown-ups that it's actually okay to play around with these things and use our imaginations?
Yeah, I love the word play. I think playful Christianity is so important. I think it comes down to a sense of assurance. Very old-fashioned word now, isn't it? But I think there's something about not being. We're so afraid as adults to get it wrong, and we've tied getting it right with salvation. So going back, what you were saying about the beginning about kind of, I read the Bible, I come to this conclusion, and then everyone else is wrong. It becomes about whether I'm right or wrong, and that becomes incredibly important because we then have raised the stakes theologically so often to say, and that's about whether I live eternally or burn in hell eternally. It really, really matters. And it seems to me that if we believe in grace, or even if you believe in election, I prefer the word grace to election myself, but actually, even from that sort of Calvinist perspective, if you believe in election, then it doesn't actually matter whether we get it right or wrong or not. And that's so liberating, so freeing. And when you think about it, it's quite laughable, the idea that whether little me or little you reads the Bible and gets it right or not is going to matter to God. I mean, that gives us an incredible and ridiculous level of power and influence and authority, which just seems to me to be, when you analyze it like that, to be both laughable and incredibly hubristic. going back to Augustine's thing, actually, if you get it wrong, but you've ended up loving God more, that's fine. It's just so liberating to read that, there in Augustine. And so I think really it is, for me, it's about removing the fear of getting it wrong. And that, I think, is why children do this much better, because they're not worried about getting it right. And partly they're not worried about getting it right because they kind of trust that, their parents or their teacher have got it. But actually, I think as adults, if we can trust that God has got it, perhaps from a more Catholic perspective, trust that kind of the church has got it, then we're freed to be playful, because it's not life and death. The idea that me reading the Bible and getting it wrong is going to affect God or affect salvation, it seems bonkers. So I think actually it is fundamentally about assurance in God's grace, and thus being set free to be playful. And I wonder if that's part of what Jesus means when he says, become like little children. Trust that, in the kind of, old-fashioned language, trust that daddy's got it, and enjoy playing.
Yeah. But I think, sometimes in the church we've prevented people from doing that because, Father knows best or the vicar knows best. And so finding that balance, and you touched before on the role of preaching in all of that there is a role for that still. But I was at a small country parish some time ago where they haven't had a priest for 3 or 4 years, and they were absolutely paralysed, I said, you could start a Bible study. Oh, we couldn't do that. How do you do that? Well, you read the Bible and you talk about it over a cup of tea. But they couldn't imagine that might be okay. I think because of some of those reasons, about a fear of getting it wrong or not being expert enough.
It's so important. I mean, the church that I'm in a team of 3 churches now. One of them, the biggest one, St Bride's, about 15 years ago now, so long before I came, had got down to 2 people, and they were thinking about whether to close. And the 2 people, plus the vicar who was for all 3, said, well, let's try something different. And because they didn't have the vicar every week, because there were only 2 of them, so it wasn't worth him going there, they started doing that on a Sunday morning. They started just going, well, do you know what? We'll just get together and we'll pray and we'll read the Bible and we'll read a reading and then we'll discuss it. We're not experts. We're not going to give a sermon. And it grew. And I mean, it has, it's now 2 congregations that are both about 50 or 60 people. And we've kept that at the heart of it. That's what I inherited when I came here, that actually the heart of the service, it's harder with more people. It's one of those problems of growth, that actually it's much harder to have a conversation with 50 or 60 people in a room than it is with 3 or 4. But that fundamental heart of, do you know what, we're going to just read this together and see how we respond, do kind of Lectio Divina and see where it takes us. Which I guess they probably wouldn't have felt free to do if it hadn't been that it was that or death. Has been so liberating. And as I say, that then fed into us doing this online, and it's just been fantastic. We don't very often have big success stories, do we, in the church? So I'll share this because I'm still so delighted about this. When we were doing our online Bible readings, and I started writing this book, and I said, can I have a bit of a group together? So we had about 20 people coming together on Zoom for me to try out some of this material and just check that I've got the right register. I see Sally's got up early to join us here, who was in that group. And one person brought their partner along, who hadn't been worshipping anything, but had a Muslim background. And at the end of it, she asked to be baptized and confirmed. She said just the idea that she could be angry with God, read the Bible for herself, not have to be an expert, not have to have learnt it all in order to be allowed to be a Christian, was so liberating. And that was just brilliant. I was so excited about that.
It's very important to tell those stories because we all need that encouragement. There's a question from Peter Judge Mears. Peter, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Miranda, I've been looking a bit at some of the narrative critical approaches to reading text. And one of the things that it hits me, has been hitting me, is how often we bring theologies quite formed that make us the kind of straitjacket however we're reading the text, and deafen us to surprises, to shocks, to discomforts, to the sort of things that the narrative can actually do. Do you touch on anything like that in your book? And because I haven't got a copy yet, so do you agree?
I think Jeremy's currently bought up all the warehouse supplies, but you might have to wait for the warehouse to get some more stocks in.
I think there's 120 copies sitting in my office, so any day now.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so important. I mean, that I've got a chapter on not specifically on narrative approaches, but on the kind of drama approaches, and on something of the difference between a sense of the text is something that we perform, putting on Christ. I love that idea, and also some of the theories around it being a kind of spur for improvisation, which again, I think in terms of talking about discipleship, I think those are really rich images to explore. But I think probably the chapter on, there are kind of set of 3 chapters on aspects of liberation theology. And I start the chapter on the hermeneutic of suspicion, which is one of those phrases that sounds terribly academic, but I want to demystify for people. And I started that not with the Bible, most of them start with a Bible passage, but that one I've started with a drawing exercise that I remember seeing years and years ago, where you sit in front of something like a standard 4-leg chair is ideal. And you don't try and draw the chair, because if you do that, everyone ends up wonky, because you try and draw what you think a chair looks like. But instead you draw what's not there. You draw the shape of the gaps where the chair isn't. And then the chair emerges. And I think that's a brilliant image, and that's what I start that chapter with, for the idea of looking into the text for what's not there, because we, as you say, we bring these glasses to it, and it seems to me that that's what these kind of identity politic types of readings, like Black theology and feminist theology and queer theology, do. Now, I totally understand the criticism that if you look at it with kind of feminist glasses or queer glasses or Black glasses, you kind of see what you go looking for. But what I try and explain in the book is that that's actually that's a feature, not a bug. That's exactly what they're trying to do. And it's a bit like, my husband's a scientist, so we get a new scientist every week. And one of the things that I found most interesting a few years ago was they were talking about how they take those pictures of space, those kind of incredible images of far galaxies. That have got colours and everything, and you think, how on earth do you get that from a telescope? And they put filters on that sort of take out certain wavelengths so that they can see. So maybe take out the white light from the stars because that's distracting, and then you can see the things at another wavelength that are creating this spiral shape. I don't understand the science, but it seems to me that that is an image for what we're doing when we put on the kind of glasses of some of these particular focuses of reading. Because the idea behind there's a plain literal reading is that we're coming to the text as neutral observers. And of course we're not. We're all coming with the background, the culture, the theologies that we've been taught. And even if we've not been taught any particular theologies, even if we're coming to it without any idea of what the church teaches, we're coming at it with our own cultural background and baggage. And so reading the Bible with a feminist lens or a queer lens or a Black lens is taking off, is saying, I'm going to deliberately for now put in front a pink filter that's going to take out whatever wavelengths it is. And it's not that it shows you things that weren't there before, and it's not that it stops the other things being true necessarily, but it helps you to take away a blinding light that would otherwise obscure other things that might have been hidden in the text, which are there, like night vision goggles, and show you a different aspect. And so ideally you'll do this with lots and lots of different lenses and get this kind of nested set of images that show different wavelengths, which give you a much bigger breadth. So yeah, I think that stuff's all great. It's not for everyone, but I think it really gives a much richer view.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Miranda. And thank you so much for getting up early and being with us this morning. I'm sure you've got a busy day ahead of you, but it's been terrific to spend a bit of time. I get nervous about these things. I was worried that conversation would run out, so I had several pages of questions just in case. But it's been absolutely terrific, and I really encourage people to get the book. As I said, there's 120 copies in my office for clergy in the northern and southern regions of this diocese who have signed up to our clergy conferences. So we wanted some common language across the regions to talk about the scriptures. But I think it would be an absolutely valuable tool to use in parishes, and it's accessible enough to be used, in a small country parish or in a city parish or wherever. And so I think it's a real gift to the church in that regard, Miranda, particularly as we grapple, with that increasing polarisation, which I think is driven in part by the way we read the scriptures. And one of the real challenges for us as we go forward is how we hold together despite that. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.